So you came up with the antidepressant food scale, and you talk about this in your book, and you go over what that is and some specific nutrients or types of foods that people should be eating. Obviously, you want to get the whole thing, pick up the book, but
I'll give you the whole thing now, Joey. Let's just share it. We care about mental health. So the antidepressant
what a
food scale,
guy! What a guy!
it's like, let's say, come on, like if I can help you beat your depression with telling you to eat more anchovies, I'm not going to hold that information back. Um, and and I'll tell you, I do think eating more anchovies can help with depression. So the way that I came up with this stuff is I was a young psychiatrist, and I was thinking, and I was a vegetarian at the time, and I was thinking, this is just really ridiculous. There's all this data about omega-3 fats and magnesium, and we don't ask anybody about what they eat. And in my own personal life, I grew up on a farm. I'd really been paying attention to my health. I was a college athlete. I really, cared about that stuff in my personal life, but in my professional life, I was in some ways trained to do what Joey experienced: ask people about symptoms, figure out the medicine, tell them to take it, give them a prescription, watch, hope that, cross your fingers, hope it works. If it doesn't, try another medicine. And I was trained a little better than that. I trained at Columbia, where we teach a lot of psychotherapy and even some integrative medicine. So I don't want to be too disparaging of my field, but I just noticed we didn't ask people about food. And so I started researching that more and more and thinking about what foods would we recommend. And then I got really neurotic, Joey, where I was like, oh, I'm like at Columbia, like the only way I can really recommend anything is I got to publish it. And so I looked around at like, how would you do that? And there were all these, remember at Whole Foods when everything had like a score out of 1,000 and like kale was 1,000. So that's called the ANDI, the aggregate nutrient density index.
Uh-huh.
And I kind of looked into that, and it's called what's called a nutrient profiling system. And these are basically where you just take the stuff that you want in food, right? All the nutrients you want, and you divide it by the stuff you don't want, all of the, let's say, salts, and I decided the only thing I was curious about was the calories. How many of a certain set of nutrients can you get per calorie? And we picked those nutrients by looking in the scientific literature, and there were 12 nutrients that stood out as really having significant data that they could influence the risk of depression. So like when a population eats more zinc, there's less depression. Or when you give people with an antidepressant, when you give them zinc, their depression gets a little bit better or better faster. So these 12 nutrients, we said, what foods have the most of these? And we listed all the animal foods and all the plant foods. And there's an open, if you just Google antidepressant food scale, you can see the list. Yep. What's curious to me, and what should be curious to you about the list, were the food categories. And so that's why when I say leafy greens, it's not just that like, hey, I love kale and the kale mafia paid me off years ago, and I'm the reason that you have like kale leggings and like, kale ice cream and all this stuff. It's that kale is really, really nutrient dense in some of these 12 nutrients. And kale fits in a food category that of the top 10 plants, 6 or 7 of them are leafy greens. It's also where these rainbow vegetables, as you look through the top 20 vegetables, there's just a lot of colors. And it led us into thinking about food categories, which is really the, watercress is at the top of the list. Now, most of you had probably not eaten watercress. I hadn't. It's actually a major part of Haitian food. I didn't actually know that, but it's a fun green to experiment with. And if you want to build your leafy green out from iceberg lettuce and kale and start thinking about more collard greens, more arugula, and that's really the hope of the book and of the work, is to take these food categories, and instead of there being like, crazy superfoods or that there's food categories where, if you're eating seafood, you're making a pretty good choice for your brain. If you're eating rainbow vegetables or nuts or beans, if you're eating lots of olive oil, like those are great brain healthy choices. And so that's how we arrived on the food categories. And then for each depression and anxiety, everybody wants a list of foods. So I just picked the 15, I thought, kind of archetypal foods from each category. They kind of passed my test as like an Indiana guy. Like I can get this at Walmart. Right. It's accessible to most people in terms of affordability, and it tastes good, and it's sort of easy to use in the kitchen.
Yeah. And that's an important point, because I think sometimes a lot of these diet books or nutrition books or anything out there, they're written for people that live in the cities and have access to, maybe Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or any of these, upper echelon grocery stores that might have these fancy foods. And they're not written for your Southern Missouri person that lived off of Crisco for a long time. But yeah, anybody can find spinach, or they're growing it, or they're farming, and they can, get a fish out of the pond. I think that's really important. And I have a lot of illustrations in there, which is really good.
Let's show some illustrations. This is an important part of the book. Well, you asked about
like
inflammation, and I did this because I just wanted to communicate the information better. And
I got one there too. Yeah.
The BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, where, like we throw these words around, and even for me, I remember when I started doing this, I was like, just making sure that some of these simple things, like what are good sources of magnesium, and what exactly does magnesium do in my brain, where it's a lot of information, especially if you don't have a science background, to kind of keep in your head. Or I also hope people use some of it to motivate themselves. When you learn that like your DNA gets protected by folate, or that zinc is one of those nutrients that improves BDNF, that sort of hormone that puts our brain more into grow mode, and that oysters and pumpkin seeds are great sources of zinc. It just, I don't know, I put zinc on my oatmeal this morning. Not zinc. I put pumpkin seeds on my oatmeal this morning.
Well, you did put zinc.
I did put zinc and magnesium and a little bit of fiber. And
I think if people started speaking, I put some zinc on my oatmeal. I put some magnesium on my fish. Yeah,
exactly. I did a nice folate sauce on there with some.
That'd be a good experiment. People are like, what the hell? I do love pumpkin seeds, by the way. Just a little crunch. Sometimes I get the sprouted ones. They are quite delicious.